Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to continue on with working on our HUD. In the last one we added different ammo numbers. And while that is all working, one thing that isn't working is the stamina bar. So first things first, we have to actually add a sprinting functionality before we can actually link that up. So that's what we're going to do right now. So to start out, let's open up our character and we're going to go into our movement graph. That's where we're going to be putting this. So we have our walking, we have our jumping, and now we're going to add our sprinting. Actually, before we do anything, we need to add that to our inputs. So let's go into our settings, project settings, and then input underneath engine, and let's create a new action mapping and call this sprint, and let's set that to our left shift key. So now when we go into our movement graph, we can call upon sprint like that, and we could start doing some things. First things first, we want to pull out some branches because there's certain things that we don't want to be able to sprint if we're doing some of these things. So let's pull out is aiming and say is not aiming, because I just like to run out of the true branch a lot. So if we are not aiming, then we're going to make another check. And we're going to say, well, are we reloading? This part is optional. Some games allow you to reload while you're sprinting. This one that we're making will not. So I'll just put optional disables sprinting while reloading. So if you want your game to be able to, if you want to be able to sprint and reload at the same time, you can remove that part. It's up to you. Some games have it like you can interrupt the sprint or interrupt the reload by sprinting. All that's up to you. But we definitely do not want to be able to sprint while we're aiming. That would look ridiculous. We're going to pull out one more branch here, and we're actually going to store this inside of a macro. A macro is different from a function a little bit in that it doesn't have these execution wires. So you can have inputs and outputs, but it doesn't have to have a white execution wire. It can output this type of data. So we're going to plug this into we're going to return a condition, a Boolean. So let's create a macro and let's call this are we exhausted ? So when it comes to our game, we have this stamina bar. And so if this stamina bar runs out, we won't be able to sprint until it reloads to a certain value. So let's create some more variables and we'll say is exhausted ? And let's create another variable and call this energy level. And we'll make this of type float. So let's go ahead and let's grab out is exhausted and say not. Just makes it more coherent for me. Personal preference. And let's grab our energy level. And let's say if this is greater than or equal to 0.2. What we can do is we can pull this out and say and. Move those and then let's plug this on the output and it'll return that. And we can just keep the name return value. So what this macro is doing is it's checking to see if both of these conditions are true, both of them. You can do one or the other by pulling out or, but in this case, we want both of these to be true. So in order to sprint, what this is essentially saying is that we cannot be exhausted. We'll turn that is exhausted variable on when energy level equals 0. And the reason that I'm setting this to 0.2 is because I want the stamina bar to refill 20% of the way up before we can sprint again. Because then what will happen is that the stamina bar will go up like 1%, and then you'll be able to sprint again, and you'll only be able to sprint for like 0.5 seconds before it runs out again. So I want to give it time for that to refill a little bit before we can start sprinting again. So let's go back to our movement and we can actually pull out this macro and do it like that. Now the reason that we created this into a macro, so technically speaking, we could have just done it like this. It means the same exact thing. But by storing this data in a macro, for one thing, it's a lot cleaner seeing it that way opposed to this way. And number two, we can now pull this out a bunch of different times and use it a bunch of different times. Whereas this, we'd have to copy and paste this long script every single time. So that's probably a pretty big tip. I remember when I first started learning how to do this, I really got caught up on like, okay, like I have to use a function here or a blueprint interface or a event dispatcher or like all these different things. And I got to put this in a macro. A lot of those things exist just for convenience. So like storing in a macro, like I said, it saves space and it allows you to use it more than once without trying to find it and copy pasting this long piece of code. But plugging this in here and doing that and using the macro does the same exact thing. So a lot of that just comes down to personal preference. And as you get more experienced in scripting, you try to do things that are more efficient. So I'm sure even in here, like you can accomplish the same thing I'm trying to accomplish multiple different ways. And you might be able to find a way that's technically speaking more efficient than my way. And that's okay. But this is a way that I know how to do it and it works. So that's what we're going to do. Okay. So if all of these conditions are true, all right, we're not exhausted, we're not reloading, and we're not aiming, then we can start sprinting. And once again, we're going to do this inside of a function. Not because it's super complicated, but because we can then call upon it every single time. All right, so in start sprint, we want to check one thing. Let's get the character movement component, and we'll say is falling. And once again, we'll say not, just because I like it that way. I don't like going out of the false branch by default. I like going out of true because it keeps the lines nice and straight. So if we're not falling, aka if we're in the air, I don't want to be able to sprint when we're in the air. That would be very unrealistic. Okay. So then what we want to do is let's grab the character movement component again, and let's get let's like set max walk speed, this value in here. And let's promote this to a variable, and we'll call this sprint speed. And by default, I'm going to make this 1,000, or not 100, 1,000. So our default max walk speed is 750, and I'm setting it to be 1,000. And then we have this, or maybe we don't. Okay, let's create a new variable and say is sprinting. I thought we made that already. I guess we didn't. It's a Boolean, and we'll set this to be true. Compile and save. That's all we have to do. So once again, let me just reiterate this. I can do this and we can make it look like that. Okay. Or I can just get start sprint and it'll look like that. So we can do it like this every single time, or we can store that data in a function and just do it like that. So we don't have to get this big ugly code every time. Look at how much space that saves. And then we don't have to copy paste this every time. We can just keep calling the function. So that is a big tip, okay? Don't get caught up on like, oh, he's using event dispatcher, he's making a function and like, oh, I'm trying to understand all this stuff. It is for convenience factor, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Cool. So now we are sprinting. What we want to do now is we want to get our loadout, because we want to have two different things happen depending on if we have a weapon or not. So let's switch on our loadout, because we still want to be able to sprint if we don't have a weapon. Okay. If we don't have a weapon, we're going to pull out a timeline, and we'll call this stamina. Okay. If we have a weapon, we want to stop shooting our gun, because when you run, you know what? I'm actually going to leave this part out of here for now, and then I'll show you what it looks like without it. I think that'll be pretty cool, actually. So we have this stamina thing. We'll save this for later. All right. Can make a note or something like that. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Okay. In the stamina bar, let's open this up and let's make this 10 seconds long. Let's be able to run for 10 seconds, and let's create a float track, and we'll call this stamina amount or something like that. Okay. Let's go ahead and create 2 keyframes. The first one will be at time 0 and a value of 1. And the second one will be at a time of 10 all the way and a value of 0. So if we click on, where are they? These little things, you can actually see that moving from that value to that value. So it's moving from 100% of itself to 0% of itself over the course of 10 seconds. We want this to play and not play from start, because if we played from start, it would restart it every time. And we want this value to move up and down into like constantly. So if it's right here, we sprint a little bit, it's going down, then we stop, and then it'll come back up. And then we reach the end, it'll do this, and then it'll come back up a little bit, and it'll go back down. If we hit play from start, every time we hit shift, it would start back up here and give us a new 10 seconds, which is not what we want to happen. So, cool. So we have our timeline. Out of the update, let's set our energy level, this variable that we created. Let's set that to the stamina amount. So now those are directly correlated. Pulling out of here, let's say equals. If our energy level equals 0, aka if we run out, let's pull out if, and then this is going to come out of the finished. Let's reroute this a little bit like that. Okay, so now if our if we run out, we're going to run an event called exhausted. So now on the other side of here, timelines have a whole bunch of cool things. We're going to create 2 custom events. We're going to call one movement stopped, another custom event, and call this exhausted. So if our energy level equals 0, we're going to run this event exhausted. Cool. Okay, let's do movement stopped first. If movement is stopped, first things first, we're going to ask if we're exhausted. Are we exhausted, people? I want to do 2 different things based on whether or not we're exhausted. All right. If we're not exhausted, sorry. I'll pull out a sequence. And what we want to do is we want to we actually have to create this. So we created a start sprint, but we also need to create a stop sprint. So let's do that now. Create a function, call it stop sprint. And this is going to be rather simple. Let's just get the character movement component. Let's set max walk speed. And let's actually promote this to a variable so if you would like to change it to something else, you can do that very easily. So max walk speed is 750. So the default was 600, but we set it as 750. And so it'll keep resetting it to 750. So this way you don't have to go into the function and like retype it in manually. You can just change the variable and it'll dynamically set for you every single time. That's what makes variables nice. And then we want to turn this is sprinting off. That's all we want to do for stop sprint. Let's go back here. So now if we're not exhausted, let's go ahead and stop sprint. All right, and then this is going to plug into stop. It's going to stop the timeline in its tracks where it is. It's going to say, hold your horses over there. Then we want to have a delay. Okay, and we want this to pause. So let's promote this to a variable and we'll say stamina regen pause, and we'll set this to be like 2 seconds. Okay, so what movement stopped is doing here, it's going to check, are we exhausted? If we're not exhausted, aka if this number is still above 0, aka if we're still somewhere in here and we're not here, then what's going to happen is we're going to stop our sprint. We're going to set our max walk speed back to normal. And then we're going to wait for 2 seconds, and then this thing is going to go in reverse. So say we're sprinting, our stamina is going down, then we stop sprinting. It's going to stop right here, wait 2 seconds, and then it's going to throw it in reverse and go back up and give us some stamina back. That's what movement stopped is doing. Now, if we are exhausted, all right, then we're going to set is exhausted to be true. So now this is nothing to run out of. It's not going to run this. It's going to run this. What we want to do is we still want to stop sprint. We want to set our movement back to normal. And then what we want to do is we want to make a delay. And we're going to have a different timer depending on if we're exhausted. So let's put this to the variable and we'll say exhausted timer. And our exhausted timer, so we're huffing and puffing, instead of 2 seconds, let's wait like 5 seconds. And then we will turn is exhausted back off. We've waited our 5 seconds, we've caught our breath. Okay, and then we're going to reverse from the end. So instead of just reverse, so like this can get reversed at any point, this event is only going to run right here if this equals 0. So we want this to make sure that it's reversing from the end, which is right here, where the value, our stamina, is at 0. So bada bing, bada boom, that's how we do it. That's everything. It's beautiful. The only other thing we got to do is we got to make sure that we cannot shoot our gun if we're sprinting, because otherwise it will shoot off way to the left and it'll look really, really stupid. But, you know, for the time being, I kind of want to showcase that because I think it would look hilarious. And it's kind of fun to like show bugs and to show like how you have to be so specific with computers. Just think of everything, right? To cause things not to be ridiculous. So the last thing that we want to do is we just want to go into our UI folder and let's go into our weapon info and let's select on our stamina bar. So we want to actually correlate this. And let's go to the percentage right here and let's create a binding. And let's say get stamina is a fine enough name. And all we want to do, this is going to be really easy. Let's get the player. Let's get our energy level. And plug that in. Bada bing, bada boom. Mr. Worldwide stepped into the room. There we go. That's all we had to do. Okay, so let's go over here now. Hopefully this works. Oh gosh. Oh, you know what? I've gotten ahead of myself. I forgot one thing. Let's go ahead and do that now. So, this is what happens when I try to purposely glitch out the game. I end up wrecking myself. Because what's happening right now is since we can only see the stamina bar if we have a weapon, and we don't have anything that happens when we have a weapon. So for the time being, just make sure both of those go into play. And then make sure our energy level is set to 1. I don't think I ever said that. This is moving in percentages. Okay, so don't set it to be 100 or whatever, set it to be 1. So now what happens? We walk over to a weapon, let me pick it up, and I have print strings to show the speed, so you'll see like 1,000. And our thing is going down like that. It's looking pretty great. But if you notice, we pick our hands off and we hit shift again. There's no way to stop from being exhausted, but you saw up there it said it's 750. So what I want to do is we can plug released and put movement stopped in there. But I want to be cool and professional looking, because a lot of games have it where you don't have to hold down shift the entire time. You can just tap on it, and that's personally what I prefer. So that is what we're going to do. We're just going to have a tap sprint button, and then once you lift your fingers off the keys, you'll stop sprinting. But first and foremost, let's go ahead and comment box this and say sprint with regenerating stamina bar, like that. Okay, like that. Feel free to make any edits like with this part or whatever. If you like having to hold down sprint and then releasing it, like I said, you can do this, then just go movement stopped, and then that will work when you release the key. But I don't like that. I don't like holding down the key the whole time. I like tapping it and then letting go and then or letting go of W, like how a lot of games work. Toggle sprint. So let's do that now. So let's run an event tick. Okay, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a macro for this. And if this macro is true, then we'll run movement stopped. What is this fancy schmancy macro that you say? Well, I'll show you. So let's go ahead and create that, and we'll say, have we stopped moving? Like that. What we want to do here is we want to get our player controller, and then we want to check, is input key down? And the key that we're looking for is W. If W is not being pressed down, and we are sprinting still, then this will return like that. So we have to be sprinting, which is initiated by hitting shift. So that's one of our parameters. And then for this to return true, we also need to not have the W key down. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. Have we stopped moving? It doesn't want to drop it in for whatever reason. But there we go. There it is, like that. And then we'll comment box just this one little part. We'll comment this and say connected to timeline. So movement stopped will then check if we're exhausted or whatever, it'll stop the sprint. It'll do all that for us. Comment box will say checks to see if W key is released while sprinting. So if we're sprinting, but we let go of W, which is what naturally happens, we'll stop sprinting. So let's go ahead and do this now. Our key, and now we're sprinting, and my pinky is not on shift right now. I let go of W and it stops. And then it goes back up, and then I'm sprinting again, I hit down shift, it's a toggle. There we go. And like that. And so if I keep doing it and then it runs out, it's gonna run that exhausted, 750, and I'm hitting it again. It's not sprinting, it's not sprinting, it's not sprinting. It gets to 20% and then it lets me do it again. So it went up a little bit further before I was able to do it again. So all that functions great. All the functionality is correct and in place. So here's our script for this. And then our script for this. The only thing we're gonna add is one extra thing right here later on. But yeah, that's everything. So in the next video, we're actually going to add an animation to make it look like our character is sprinting, and then we will have all of that correctly set up. So I'll see you there.